in the psychology department of Cornell University, preserved in a glass jar filled with formaldehyde, sits one of the most notorious brains in American criminal history. At 1,673 centimeters, it belonged to a man who could speak 8 languages fluently, translate ancient Greek texts, and formulate complex theories about human linguistics. Yet this same brilliant mind orchestrated brutal murders that shocked 19th century America. The brain belonged to Edward Howard Rulloff, teacher, doctor, inventor, philologist, and killer. For decades, authorities across New York State struggled to understand how such intellectual brilliance could coexist with such calculated evil. Tonight, we uncover the chilling truth behind the man newspapers called the Genius Killer. A story of academic ambition funded by blood, where the pursuit of knowledge became an obsession that justified murder. Before we continue with the story of Edward Rulloff and his reign of terror across New York's Finger Lakes region, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We upload new dark mysteries every week, and we'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling us your state or city. The case of Edward Rulloff would forever change how Americans viewed the criminal mind, proving that evil could wear the mask of scholarly respectability, and that genius itself could become a weapon of destruction. The year was 1842, and the rolling hills of central New York were alive with opportunity and transformation. The Erie Canal had turned sleepy farming communities into bustling trade centers, while the Second Great Awakening had filled the region with religious fervor and social reform movements. Education was becoming the pathway to prosperity in this new America, and small towns competed to attract learned men who could elevate their cultural standing. It was into this landscape of hope and progress that a young man named Edward Rulloff arrived in the village of Dryan, just east of Ithaca. To the locals, he seemed like a gift from Providence itself. Rulloff was 23 years old, tall and distinguished-looking, with a commanding presence that immediately set him apart from the rough canal workers and farmers who typically passed through town. His dark hair was meticulously groomed, his clothing neat and scholarly, and his piercing dark eyes seemed to hold depths of knowledge that impressed everyone he met. When he spoke, it was with the cultured accent of an educated gentleman, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. The residents of Dryden had rarely encountered anyone with such apparent audition. Rulloff claimed extensive knowledge of botany and medicine, could recite passages in Latin, Greek, and German with fluid precision, and seemed equally comfortable discussing philosophy, literature, and the emerging sciences. When he began delivering lectures on phrenology, the popular pseudoscience of reading character through skull measurements, the townspeople gathered in amazement at his apparent mastery of this fashionable field of study. But beneath this impressive exterior lay secrets that would have horrified his admirers. Born John Edward Howard Rolfson, near Street John, New Brunswick, around 1819 or 1820, he had already lived a double life before crossing into the United States. His father, Rudolf Rulofsson, had been a Danish immigrant who achieved some prosperity as a justice of the peace, but the family's fortunes had declined after his death in 1827. Young Edward had shown early promise as a scholar, devouring books, with an insatiable hunger for knowledge that impressed his teachers and neighbors alike. However, his intellectual gifts had been corrupted by an early taste for crime. By the time he reached his teens, Edward had been caught in a series of suspicious fires at the dry goods store where he worked. Arson apparently designed to cover up inventory thefts, when he was observed wearing clothing that matched items reported stolen. He was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The experience should have been a wake-up call, but instead it became his criminal education, teaching him the value of careful planning and the importance of maintaining a respectable facade. After his release, he had crossed into the United States, abandoning his birth name for the more distinguished Edward Rulloff. The change was more than cosmetic. It represented his transformation from common criminal to something far more dangerous. A predator who could blend seamlessly into respectable society. His years of imprisonment had given him time to study and plan, emerging with a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate others through displays of learning and charm. In Dryden, Rulloff quickly established himself as an invaluable member of the community. He found employment as a clerk in the local drugstore, where his apparent knowledge of botanical medicines impressed both his employer and customers. His learning seemed boundless. He could discuss the latest philosophical works from Europe, analyze political developments with insight, and demonstrate practical knowledge of everything from photography to carpentry. The community, starved for intellectual stimulation in their rural setting, embraced him with an enthusiasm that fed his growing sense of superiority. His reputation grew rapidly through the region. Farmers consulted him about their crops. Local politicians sought his advice on matters of governance, and prominent families invited him to dinner parties, where his conversation was the evening's entertainment. Soon, the community offered him the position of headmaster at their local school, a role that would give him not only respectability, but access to young minds he could influence and potentially corrupt. Among his pupils was 17-year-old Harriet Shutt, daughter of one of the area's most respected farming families. Harriet was considered a rare beauty, even in a region known for its handsome women. Tall and slender, with long light brown hair that caught the sunlight, pale skin that spoke of Gentile upbringing, and hazel eyes that sparkled with intelligence and gentle humor. She possessed the kind of refined mannerisms and educated speech that marked her as gentry in this rural community. Having been fortunate enough to receive more education than most young women of her time, the Shutt family had prospered through hard work and careful management of their substantial farm holdings. They were among the area's most prominent citizens, known for their generosity to neighbors and their active participation in community affairs. Harriet's father, John Shutt, was a man of considerable influence, who took pride in his daughter's accomplishments and had high expectations for her future marriage. The family represented everything that was stable and respectable about rural American life in the 1840s. The attraction between teacher and student was immediate and intense, though it would prove to be built on the most dangerous foundation imaginable. Rolfe, despite his scholarly demeanor, possessed a magnetic charisma that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He could be utterly charming when it suited his purposes, weaving tales of his travels and studies that painted him as a man of the world who had seen wonders beyond the provincial horizons of central New York. For a young woman like Harriet, living within the comfortable but confining boundaries of rural society, he represented everything exotic and sophisticated that her sheltered life had never offered. But even in these early days of courtship, there were warning signs that those around them chose to ignore or rationalize away. Rolfe's temper, when provoked, could be frightening in its intensity and seemingly unpredictable in its triggers. He displayed an almost pathological jealousy whenever other men showed even innocent interest in Harriet, and his moods could shift from charming affability to cold, calculating rage in moments. The Shutt family, while impressed by his obvious learning and apparent prospects, harbored private doubts about their daughter's suitor that they found difficult to articulate. On December 31, 1843, as heavy snow blanketed the Finger Lakes region, and families throughout central New York gathered for New Year's celebrations, Edward Rulloff and Harriet Shutt were united in marriage during a simple but well-attended ceremony at the Shutt family farm. The wedding should have been a joyous occasion, marking the beginning of a promising union between two intelligent young people. But even on this day meant for celebration, Rudolph's true nature began to emerge in ways that should have terrified everyone present. The ceremony itself proceeded normally until the traditional moment when the minister, following time-honored custom, congratulated the bride with a gentle kiss on the cheek. In that instant, Rudolph's carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing the violent jealousy that would define their marriage. His face darkened with such fury that several wedding guests stepped back in alarm, and his eyes flashed with a rage so intense and unexpected that it cast a pall over the entire celebration. Here was a man flying into jealous fury over an innocent gesture from a clergyman, behavior that should have warned everyone present of the violence lurking beneath his scholarly exterior. The wedding guests, unsure how to interpret this disturbing outburst, chose to attribute it to wedding day nerves, or perhaps the stress of joining a prominent family. But Harriet herself had seen something in her new husband's eyes that chilled her to the bone, though she told herself it was merely the intensity of his love for her. The honeymoon period that followed was brief and troubled, marked by moments of passionate devotion, interrupted by flashes of the same terrifying rage that had marked their wedding day. Within months of their marriage, Rulloff had convinced Harriet to move with him to the nearby village of Lansing, ostensibly to give them privacy to build their new life together, but really to isolate his young wife from her family's protective influence. The move represented more than a simple change of address. It was a calculated strategy to cut Harriet off from the support system that might have helped her escape the nightmare her marriage was becoming. In Lansing, Rulloff set up practice as a botanical physician, using his self-taught knowledge of herbs and medicines to treat local residents who had limited access to formally trained doctors. His reputation as a healer grew rapidly, and soon prominent families throughout the region were seeking his services for everything from common ailments to serious medical emergencies. He charged reasonable fees and seemed genuinely concerned for his patients' welfare, further cementing his reputation as a valuable member of the community. The young couple's modest home became a center of intellectual activity in the small village. Rudolph continued his scholarly pursuits, filling their rooms with books on subjects ranging from classical languages to natural philosophy. He spent hours each day reading and writing, working on what he claimed would be groundbreaking theories about the formation and evolution of human language. To observers, he appeared to be the ideal combination of practical healer and theoretical scholar, a man who could bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern learning. In April 1845, after more than a year of marriage, Harriet gave birth to a daughter they named Priscilla. The infant was healthy and beautiful, with her mother's delicate features and what appeared to be her father's intelligent eyes. For a brief time, the arrival of their child seemed to calm Rudolph's volatile nature and bring out genuinely tender qualities that few had suspected he possessed. He appeared devoted to both his wife and infant daughter, spending hours reading to them from his extensive library and discussing his ambitious plans for their family's future. Rudolph spoke frequently of opportunities waiting for him in the growing territories of the American West, particularly Ohio, where he claimed to have been offered a position as a college professor. He painted vivid pictures of the life they could build there, away from the constraints and gossip of small-town New York, where his genius would finally receive the recognition it deserved. These dreams seemed reasonable to Harriet, who had grown accustomed to her husband's grandiose visions and believed in his exceptional abilities. But the domestic tranquility was shattered by the continued presence in their lives of Dr. Henry Bohl, Rolf's business partner and Harriet's cousin. Bohl was a genuine physician who had taken Rulloff under his wing to teach him botanical medicine, impressed by the younger man's apparent knowledge and dedication. He was also a member of the extended Schutt family network, maintaining the kind of easy, affectionate relationships with his female relatives that was common in close-knit rural communities. Bohl's friendly demeanor and family connections, which should have been natural and unremarkable, became the source of Rolf's growing paranoia and rage. The doctor's habit of greeting Harriet with a kiss on the cheek, the same innocent gesture that had triggered Rolf's wedding day outburst, drove him into paroxysms of jealous fury. He became convinced that his wife was having an affair with her cousin, despite the complete absence of any evidence to support his suspicions, and the ridiculous nature of the accusation, given their family relationship. As spring turned to summer, In 1845, Ralph's jealousy reached dangerous proportions. He began following Harriet whenever she left the house, questioning her about every conversation she had with other men, and flying into rages over imagined slights and perceived infidelities. The brilliant scholar, who could discuss philosophy and literature with such eloquence, became a monster of suspicion and violence within the walls of his own home. The crisis that would shatter multiple families began in May 1845, when tragedy struck the extended Shutt clan. Harriet's sister-in-law, the wife of her brother, William, fell gravely ill shortly after giving birth to her second child. Both mother and infant were suffering from what appeared to be a serious infection, and the family naturally turned to their relative by marriage, who had established himself as a skilled healer. Rulloff agreed to treat them, preparing an herbal remedy using his botanical knowledge and administering it personally to both patients with apparent concern for their welfare. Within 48 hours of receiving Ralph's treatment, both the young mother and her infant child were dead. While such deaths were tragically common in an era before modern medicine and antibiotics, the timing and circumstances struck some family members as suspicious. Rulloff showed no grief at their passing, instead making ominous comments to his mother-in-law about who might go next, words that seemed less like expressions of sorrow and more like veiled threats. The deaths created an immediate and irreparable rift between Rulloff and the Shutt family. Whispers began to circulate about whether the supposed healer had actually hastened the deaths of his own relatives, though no one dared voice such accusations openly. The family's previous reservations about Rulloff crystallized into active suspicion and hostility, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere that would soon explode into violence. Feeling the weight of his in-laws' suspicion and increasingly desperate to escape the growing hostility around him, Rudolph became more determined than ever to convince Harriet to abandon her family and move to Ohio with him. He painted vivid pictures of the new life they could build in the West, where his genius would finally receive proper recognition, and where they could escape the small-minded gossips who failed to appreciate his exceptional gifts. But Harriet, still grieving the deaths of her sister-in-law and infant niece, was reluctant to leave her family during such a difficult time. The couple's arguments about their future became increasingly violent and frequent. Rulloff could not understand why his wife would choose loyalty to her family over devotion to him, and his frustration fed the paranoid conviction that she was being turned against him by relatives who had never truly accepted him. His jealousy, always simmering beneath the surface, now boiled over into open accusations of infidelity and betrayal. On the evening of June 22, 1844, as a summer thunderstorm rumbled across Cauga Lake and lightning illuminated the darkening sky, Edward Rulloff committed the crime that would define his legacy and haunt central New York for generations. The humid air was thick with tension as another argument erupted between husband and wife in their small house in Lansing, this time about Rudolph's increasingly desperate demands that they leave immediately for Ohio. Harriet was in the kitchen, engaged in the mundane, domestic task of crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle when her husband's rage finally reached its breaking point. He had been drinking, which always made his temper more volatile, and his accusations of infidelity had become more wild and specific. When Harriet laughed off his latest charges and firmly refused his demands to abandon her grieving family, something fundamental snapped in the scholar's brilliant but twisted mind. The sequence of events that followed would be recounted years later when Rulloff finally confessed to the crime, providing details that could only have come from someone who was present during those terrible moments. In the explosion of pure rage, fed by months of building resentment and paranoid jealousy, Rulloff snatched the iron pestle from his wife's hands and brought it down on her forehead with devastating force. The blow was delivered with such violence that Harriet collapsed instantly, blood streaming from the massive wound and pooling beneath her head on the kitchen floor. The sound of the impact and her falling body seemed to echo through the small house, followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the rumble of thunder outside. Rudolph stood over his wife's body, watching as the life drained out of the woman he claimed to love, feeling no remorse but only a cold satisfaction that she would never defy him again. But his crime was not yet complete. As Harriet lay dying on the kitchen floor, their infant daughter, Priscilla, began to cry in her cradle, disturbed by the commotion, and perhaps sensing that something terrible had happened to her mother. The sound of the baby's wailing seemed to pierce through Rudolph's rage, reminding him that he now had a witness to his crime, a witness who would someday grow old enough to remember and testify against him. With the same calculating coldness that had marked his academic pursuits, Rulloff made another terrible decision. Moving to his collection of botanical medicines, he prepared what he later described as a narcotic, likely a concentrated dose of the same plant-based poisons he had been using to treat patients throughout the region. The preparation of the fatal dose was done with the precision of a trained pharmacist, measuring and mixing ingredients with the same care he had once devoted to healing. Returning to the cradle where Priscilla continued to cry, Rulloff administered the poison with gentle hands, perhaps telling himself that he was simply putting the child to sleep. The baby's cries gradually weakened and then stopped entirely, leaving the house filled with the kind of terrible silence that would haunt anyone who had witnessed such evil. In the space of less than an hour, the brilliant scholar had destroyed his entire family, transforming from respected healer to cold-blooded killer. The disappearance of Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff in late June 1844 sent shockwaves through the close-knit community of Lansing and the surrounding Finger Lakes region. When concerned neighbors came calling the following day and found Rulloff alone in his house, his explanations raised immediate and profound suspicions that would only deepen with each passing hour. The scene inside the Rulloff home told a story that contradicted every explanation their host offered. The house bore all the signs of hasty abandonment. Beds left unmade, with sheets twisted and thrown aside. Dirty dishes scattered across the kitchen table, where they had apparently been left misdeal, and personal belongings scattered haphazardly throughout the rooms. Most tellingly, Harriet's cherished traveling basket, which she never went anywhere without, still sat prominently on her bureau, alongside her jewelry and other precious possessions. Rolf's attempts to explain his family's absence only deepened the growing mystery and suspicion. His stories changed with each telling, as if he were improvising details as he went along. Initially, he claimed that Harriet and Priscilla had gone to visit relatives in a cottage between Kaga and Seneca Lakes. But when pressed for specifics, he couldn't provide exact locations or expected return dates. When this story failed to satisfy questioners, he switched to claiming they were visiting family in Erie, Pennsylvania, and finally settled on an elaborate tale about their relocation to Madison, Ohio. Each new version of events raised more questions than it answered. Why would Harriet leave without her traveling basket and personal effects? How could she have departed without telling her close-knit family where she was going? What circumstances would have motivated such a sudden and secretive departure? The more Rudolph talked, the less believable his stories became, and the more convinced his listeners grew that something terrible had happened to his wife and child. When confronted directly about these inconsistencies, Ralph offered to write a letter to his wife, asking her to contact her family and dispel what he characterized as malicious rumors circulating about their welfare. The letter was duly written in his precise scholarly hand, with flowery language, expressing concern for her family's worries and requesting immediate communication to set their minds at ease. But days turned to weeks, and no response ever came, a silence that spoke louder than any words could have. For 6 agonizing weeks, Rulloff maintained his increasingly desperate charade, playing the role of the concerned husband, whose family was simply traveling for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He continued his practice as a botanical physician, treating patients with the same apparent skill and compassion that had made his reputation. all while knowing that the bodies of his victims lay hidden beneath the dark waters of Cauga Lake. But the community's suspicions grew stronger and more focused with each passing day. The Shutt family, led by Harriet's protective brothers, William and Ephraim, refused to accept Rolf's evolving explanations. They knew their sister's character intimately, her deep devotion to family, her responsible nature, and her habit of maintaining regular correspondence with relatives. Her sudden disappearance without word was completely inconsistent with everything they knew about her personality and values. The family's investigation took on the character of a determined manhunt, with William and Ephraim Shutt questioning neighbors, searching the surrounding countryside, and applying increasing pressure on their brother-in-law to provide satisfactory answers. Their efforts were complicated by Rolf's continued presence in the community and his ability to maintain his facade of respectability. But their persistence began to yield disturbing information about his behavior in the days immediately following the disappearance. Several neighbors came forward to report seeing Rulloff on the morning after his family's supposed departure, loading mysterious bundles and what appeared to be a large, heavy chest into a wagon borrowed from the Anderson family. Witnesses described his demeanor as nervous and festive, completely unlike his usual confident bearing. Most significantly, multiple people reported seeing him driving the loaded wagon toward Cauga Lake in the early morning hours, taking a route that led away from any of the destinations he had claimed his family had traveled to. When the pressure of investigation and community suspicion became too great, Rulloff suddenly vanished from Lansing, claiming he was going to rejoin his family in Ohio and bring them back to silence the unfair accusations being made against him. His departure, in the middle of the night, without settling his affairs or providing any forwarding address, only confirmed the community's worst suspicions about his guilt. But Ephraimish was not content to let his sister's suspected killer escape justice through flight. A man of considerable determination and physical courage, he mounted his buckboard and set off in pursuit, beginning a dramatic cross-state manhunt that would take him through multiple cities and railroad stations. The chase became a test of wills between a grieving brother seeking justice and a killer desperately trying to escape the consequences of his crimes. The pursuit reached its climax at a crowded train platform in Rochester, where Ephraim spotted Rulloff attempting to board a departing train bound for Buffalo and points west. In a scene that could have been lifted from the pages of a contemporary adventure novel, Rolf attempted to disappear into the crowd of travelers, using his knowledge of human nature and crowd psychology to evade detection. But Ephraim's determination proved stronger than Rolf's cunning, and after a thorough search of the train cars, he found the fugitive hiding in the rearmost compartment. Even when cornered, Rulloff maintained his composure and continued his deception with remarkable audacity. Rather than confessing or showing any sign of guilt, he expressed surprise and pleasure at encountering his brother-in-law, claiming that the meeting was fortuitous, since he was indeed on his way to rejoin Harriet and Priscilla in Ohio. With characteristic boldness, he even suggested that Ephraim accompany him on the journey to see for himself that his sister and niece were safe and well. The two men traveled together in an atmosphere of barely concealed tension, with Ephraim watching his companion's every move, while Rolf maintained his performance as the innocent husband. Eager to reunite his family, they proceeded to Buffalo, where they spent an uncomfortable night at a hotel, each man knowing that the other was playing a dangerous game whose outcome could mean life or death. The next morning, as they made their way to the crowded docks to catch an early steamboat for Cleveland, Rulloff demonstrated the cunning that would serve him throughout his criminal career. Using the confusion and crowds of a busy port as cover, he managed to slip away from Ephraim's watchful eye, disappearing into the press of passengers boarding the steamboat. By the time Ephraim realized his quarry had escaped, Rulloff had vanished completely, leaving his brother-in-law alone and more convinced than ever that Harriet and Priscilla were dead. Back in Lansing, the community organized a systematic search for the missing women that represented one of the most thorough criminal investigations of its era. Kanga Lake, the longest of the 11 glacial finger lakes in central New York, became the focus of their efforts based on witness reports of Rulloff's suspicious wagon journey. Teams of men worked in shifts, using hooks, nets, and primitive diving equipment to search the lake's murky depths for any trace of the bodies. The search was hampered by the lake's considerable depth and the unclear waters that could hide secrets for decades. Kanga Lake extends for nearly 40 meters and reaches depths of over 400 feet in some areas, providing countless places where weighted bodies could rest undisturbed. Despite weeks of intensive searching that involved dozens of volunteers and considerable expense, no trace of Harriet or Priscilla was ever found. The investigation revealed increasingly disturbing details about Rulloff's behavior in the days following the murders. Witnesses described his strange alternation between apparent grief and almost cheerful indifference to his family's fate. Most damning was his apparent lack of genuine effort to locate his missing wife and child. Behavior completely inconsistent with that of an innocent husband and father whose family had truly vanished under mysterious circumstances. Meanwhile, the brilliant scholar had not been idle during his months of freedom, continuing his established pattern of reinvention and deception. He had made his way to Melville, Pennsylvania, where he established himself under the alias James Nelson. Once again, his charisma and apparent learning opened doors that should have remained closed to a fugitive from justice, and he was soon accepted into the town's intellectual and social circles. In Melville, Rulloff befriended a local inventor and businessman, convincing him to enter into a partnership that would have provided both financial security and social respectability. His new persona as James Nelson was so carefully crafted and convincing that he was actually offered a professorship at Jefferson College, a position that would have fulfilled his academic ambitions while providing perfect cover for his criminal past. But his dreams of respectability were shattered when Albert Jarvis, the young man whose family had befriended Rulloff during his time in Ithaca, wrote to inform him that both he and his mother had become convinced of Rulloff's innocence and were working to clear his name. The letter, meant as good news, actually served as a warning that law enforcement officials were closing in on his location and that his time as James Nelson was coming to an end. The wheels of justice, though slow in the 1840s, were inexorably closing in on Edward Rulloff. In 1845, nearly a year after Harriet and Priscilla's disappearance, he was finally tracked down by determined law enforcement officials and arrested on charges related to his family's disappearance. The legal proceedings that followed would span decades and reveal the true extent of his criminal genius, as well as the dangerous flaws in the American justice system that allowed such a predator to repeatedly escape punishment. The prosecution faced an almost impossible task in trying to convict Rulloff of murder, without bodies, physical evidence, or eyewitnesses to the actual crimes. They were forced to build their case entirely on circumstantial evidence and suspicious behavior. The grand jury, recognizing the difficulty of proving murder beyond a reasonable doubt, chose instead to indict Rulloff on the lesser charge of kidnapping his wife, a decision that would have profound consequences for the pursuit of justice. Rulloff conducted his own defense with the skill and sophistication of a trained attorney, demonstrating legal knowledge that astonished court observers and frustrated prosecutors. His arguments focused relentlessly on the lack of physical evidence, the absence of bodies, and the entirely circumstantial nature of the case against him. He cited legal precedents with precision, constructed logical arguments that impressed even hostile observers, and cross-examined witnesses with a thoroughness that would have done credit to an experienced trial lawyer. Despite his legal brilliance, the jury was ultimately convinced of his guilt by the overwhelming weight of circumstantial evidence and the plausibility of his various explanations for his family's disappearance. In 1846, he was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at Orange State Prison. one of New York's most notorious correctional facilities. Rather than breaking Rulloff's spirit or reforming his character, prison became his university and laboratory. He threw himself into academic pursuits with obsessive dedication, using his confinement to teach himself philology, the scientific study of language, development, and evolution. His cell was transformed into a scholar's study filled with books on linguistics, classical languages, and comparative grammar that he somehow managed to acquire despite the restrictions of prison life. Rulloff's intellectual pursuits in prison were not merely academic exercises, but part of a grandiose plan to achieve the fame and recognition he believed his genius deserved. He developed what he considered to be revolutionary theories about the formation and evolution of human language. Working on a comprehensive treatise he planned to title Method in the Formation of Language. He genuinely believed this work would establish him as one of the foremost linguistic scholars of his generation and earn him immortality in academic circles. His scholarly reputation within the prison grew to legendary proportions. He was consulted by guards and administrators on matters requiring education and intelligence, tutored fellow inmates in classical languages and mathematics, and even taught classes for visitors who came to witness the phenomenon of the criminal genius. His cell became a destination for curious intellectuals and reformers who were fascinated by the paradox of such learning existing within a convicted criminal. Among those most influenced by Rulloff's apparent reformation and scholarly achievements was Albert Jarvis, the teenage son of the Ithaca undersheriff. Jarvis, barely out of his teens, but already fascinated by classical learning, became Rulloff's most devoted student, spending hours in his cell studying Greek and Latin under the tutelage of the imprisoned scholar. The relationship that developed between teacher and student would prove crucial to Rulloff's future escape attempts and criminal enterprises. When Rulloff was finally released in 1856, after serving his full 10-year sentence, he found Tompkins County authorities waiting with a new warrant, this time charging him directly with the murder of his wife, Harriet. His legal mind immediately grasped the implications and potential defenses, and he argued vigorously that this constituted double jeopardy, claiming he could not be tried twice for the same basic crime. The district attorney, perhaps recognizing the weakness of the double jeopardy argument, or simply wanting to avoid a complex legal battle, made a tactical decision that would prove both clever and ultimately futile. Rather than pursuing the charge for Harriet's murder, he dropped that case entirely and instead filed new charges for the murder of infant Priscilla, a separate crime that would not be covered by double jeopardy protections. The second trial, carefully moved to the nearby town of Agon to ensure an impartial jury that had not been influenced by local publicity, again resulted in a conviction and a sentence of death. But Rulloff's legal education during his imprisonment had not been wasted, and his defense team mounted a sophisticated appeal, arguing that murder could not be proven in the absence of a corpse, a legal principle known as the corpus delta rule, as his case worked its way through the higher courts. Generating considerable legal precedent and scholarly discussion, Rulloff prepared for his most audacious escape yet. In 1858, while confined in the Ithaca jail, awaiting the outcome of his appeal, he vanished under circumstances that strongly suggested inside assistance from someone with detailed knowledge of the facility's security procedures. The most likely explanation for his escape was that Albert Jarvis, now working for his father, the undersheriff, and still devoted to his former teacher, had helped orchestrate the breakout. Rulloff had always possessed an uncanny ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in those around him, convincing them of his innocence through sheer force of personality and intellectual charisma. Free once again, and now a fugitive from a death sentence, Rulloff embarked on the most productive and dangerous phase of his criminal career. He traveled extensively throughout the Northeast and Midwest, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement, while continuing both his scholarly work and his criminal enterprises. His wanted posters described him as extremely dangerous and likely to be armed, but they could not capture the true nature of his threat. A brilliant mind, utterly without conscience, capable of inspiring trust even while planning betrayal. During these fugitive years, Rulloff perfected his techniques of deception and reinvention. Under various aliases, he worked as a teacher, photographer, inventor, carpet designer, and even photographer, always maintaining the facade of respectability, while supporting himself through carefully planned thefts and frauds. His intellectual gifts continued to open doors that his criminal record would have kept closed, allowing him to infiltrate respectable society repeatedly. In 1861, his luck finally ran out when he was captured and returned to New York to face justice. This time, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in Sing Prison, the notorious maximum security facility that housed the state's most dangerous criminals. But even in this harsh environment, Rulloff managed to thrive, using his intellectual gifts to earn privileges and make valuable connections that would serve his future criminal enterprises. It was at Sing Sing that Rulloff met William T. Dexter, a professional burglar who would become his partner in the crimes that would ultimately seal his fate. Dexter was impressed by Rolf's obvious intelligence and sophistication, recognizing that an alliance with such a brilliant criminal mind could be extremely profitable for both of them. Together with the still loyal Albert Jarvis, they formed a criminal gang that would terrorize the Northeast for nearly a decade. Their criminal methods were sophisticated for the era, focusing on high-end burglaries that targeted stores carrying expensive fabrics and luxury goods that could be easily transported and sold in distant markets. Rolf's role was as the mastermind and planner, his superior intelligence allowing him to organize their operations with military precision, while his scholarly reputation provided perfect cover for their activities. Based primarily in Brooklyn, the gang operated throughout New York, New England, and Pennsylvania, building a reputation for professionalism and avoiding violence that made them particularly difficult for law enforcement to track. They lived comfortable lives between crimes, with Rulloff continuing his academic work and even attempting to gain recognition in legitimate scholarly circles. In 1869, Rulloff learned of the first convention of the American Philological Association scheduled to be held in Poughkeepsie, and saw it as his golden opportunity to break into legitimate academic circles and gain the recognition he had craved for decades. Under the carefully crafted alias, Professor Yuri Lori, he submitted a manuscript detailing his revolutionary theory of language formation, a work he had been perfecting during his years of imprisonment and fugitive life. Rolf's academic ambitions revealed the true depth of his megalomaniacal personality and his complete disconnect from reality. He genuinely believed that his linguistic theories would revolutionize the field and earn him immortality as one of history's great scholars. His manuscript method in the formation of language represented years of obsessive work, and he was convinced it contained insights that would transform human understanding of communication and thought itself. To demonstrate his confidence in the work's value and his desperate need for both money and recognition, Rulloff announced his intention to auction the manuscript for the staggering sum of $500,000, a fortune that would be worth millions in today's current. The astronomical asking price reflected not just his financial desperation, but his grandiose self-assessment and complete inability to gauge the real worth of his theories or the likelihood of academic acceptance. When the Philological Association not only rejected his manuscript, but showed no interest whatsoever in his theories, Rolf's fury was volcanic and transformative. The rejection by the very academic community he had spent decades trying to join pushed him over the edge from ambitious criminal to something far more dangerous. If the world would not recognize his genius voluntarily, he would force them to acknowledge it through increasingly bold and violent crimes. The rejection crystallized all of Rolf's resentments and paranoid beliefs about society's failure to appreciate his exceptional gifts. His crimes after 1869 became more daring and brutal, as if he were challenging law enforcement to catch him, while simultaneously punishing a world that had failed to give him his due recognition. The brilliant scholar was transforming into something far more dangerous. A killer who felt the world owed him recognition for his superior intellect. It was during this period of escalating violence and desperation that Rolf's true psychopathic nature became most clearly apparent to those who observed him closely. Modern psychiatrists examining the historical records of his behavior and statements have concluded that he displayed virtually every characteristic of clinical psychopathy as we understand it today. He showed no genuine remorse for his victims, possessed an inflated and grandiose sense of his own importance, demonstrated a complete lack of empathy for the suffering of others, and maintained an unshakable belief in his own superiority, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Yet his charm and intellectual gifts allowed him to continue manipulating those around him with frightening ease. Even fellow criminals were drawn to his magnetic personality and convinced of his exceptional abilities. He could inspire loyalty, devotion, and even love in people who should have recognized him as a dangerous predator, demonstrating the sophisticated psychological manipulation skills that made him far more dangerous than ordinary criminals. As 1870 dawned, Rolf was growing increasingly desperate on multiple fronts. His academic dreams had been publicly crushed by the very scholars whose recognition he had sought. His criminal enterprises were barely supporting him and his partners, and time was running short for him to achieve the recognition and immortality he believed he deserved. The combination of intellectual arrogance, criminal skill, and psychological instability was creating a perfect storm that would soon result in the crime that would finally bring him to justice. Albert Jarvis, still devoted to the man who had educated him in classical languages and convinced him of his exceptional genius, brought Rulloff word of what seemed like the perfect opportunity to solve their financial problems. The Halbert Brothers dry goods store in Binghamton had recently received a large and valuable shipment of expensive silks from New York City, exactly the kind of high-value, easily portable merchandise their gang had made their specialty. The store's location near the Chenango River provided multiple escape routes, and the presence of only 2 young clerks as night security made it seemed like an ideal target for their sophisticated criminal operation. Jarvis had done careful reconnaissance of the building and its surroundings, timing the clerks' routines, and identifying the best entry and exit points. Everything seemed perfectly planned for what they expected would be their most profitable score yet. But criminal genius, as events would soon prove, was not the same as academic brilliance, and Rudolph's intellectual arrogance would finally lead him to make the mistakes that had eluded him for so many years. The early morning hours of August 17, 1870, were humid and oppressively still as 3 shadowy figures approached the Halbert Brothers dry goods store in Binghamton with the confidence of experienced professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. Edward Rulloff, Albert Jarvis, and William Dexter had spent days studying the building's layout, the habits of the 2 young clerks who lived above the store, and the best routes for both entry and escape. Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs were typical of their era as shop clerks, young men from working-class families who lived above their place of employment, both for convenience and security. The recent increase in commercial burglaries throughout central New York had made store owners increasingly nervous about protecting their valuable inventory, and the presence of live-in guards was considered essential protection against the sophisticated criminal gangs that were operating throughout the region. Neither young man was prepared for what was about to unfold, nor could they have imagined that they were about to confront one of the most dangerous criminal minds in American history. They had settled into their costs in the quarters above the store, trusting in their vigilance and the pistol that Merrick kept under his pillow to protect both themselves and their employer's valuable merchandise. The burglars' plan seemed foolproof, representing the culmination of decades of criminal experience and careful study of human psychology. They would enter through the rear of the building during the deepest part of the night, subdue the sleeping clerks with chloroform fumes that would render them unconscious without permanent harm, and make off with the most valuable silks before anyone could raise an alarm. Rulloff, the intellectual mastermind of the operation, had convinced himself that his superior planning and understanding of human nature would ensure their success. He had studied the building's architecture, timed the clerks' routines, and calculated escape routes with the same precision he had once applied to his linguistic theories. His partners trusted completely in his leadership, convinced that his genius made their operation virtually foolproof. Moving like ghosts through the darkened streets of Binghamton, the three men made their way to the rear of the building, where a basement entrance provided access to the store's interior. They had practiced this approach multiple times, and each man knew his role precisely. In the basement, they donned masks to conceal their identities and removed their shoes to muffle their footsteps on the wooden floors above. The chloroform was lit and allowed to burn, filling the basement air with its characteristic, sickly sweet vapor that they hoped would rise through the building and render the sleeping clerks unconscious. Then, step by careful step, they began their ascent toward the quarters where Merrick and Burroughs lay sleeping, completely unaware that their lives were about to be changed forever. But even the most carefully laid plans can be undone by a single moment of carelessness. And Albert Jarvis, despite years of criminal experience and careful preparation, made the fatal error that would transform a simple burglary into a murder. Seen in the darkness of the unfamiliar building, he stumbled over an unseen obstacle, perhaps a piece of furniture or a box of merchandise, sending a crash echoing through the structure that shattered the night's silence like a gunshot. The sound jolted both clerks instantly awake, their hearts pounding as they realized that the danger they had been hired to prevent was actually occurring. In the space of seconds, the carefully planned operation had descended into chaos, with three desperate criminals facing two determined young men who were prepared to fight for their lives and their employer's property. Frederick Merrick, displaying the kind of courage that would have made him a hero in any other circumstances, reacted with remarkable speed and determination. Grabbing the pistol he kept loaded under his pillow for exactly such emergencies, he aimed it at the fleeing figure of Rulloff and pulled the trigger. The weapon clicked but failed to discharge, a misfire that would ultimately cost the brave young clerk his life and seal Rolf's fate as a killer rather than merely a thief. Undeterred by his weapon's failure, Merrick seized a heavy wooden stool and hurled it at the intruders with considerable force, demonstrating the kind of fighting spirit that marked him as someone who would not surrender easily. Meanwhile, Gilbert Burroughs had thrown himself at William Dexter, and the two men crashed into furniture and walls as they fought desperately in the darkened room, with Burroughs managing to land several solid blows on his opponent. When Merrick rushed to help his colleague, the tide of battle seemed to be turning in favor of the defenders, and for a moment it appeared that the two brave clerks might actually succeed in capturing or driving off their attackers. But it was then that Edward Rulloff made the decision that would finally bring his decades-long criminal career to an end and transform him from master thief to cold-blooded killer. Drawing the pistol he carried for exactly such emergencies, Rulloff fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to intimidate the clerks into submission without actually harming them. But the brave young men refused to yield to threats, and Merrick threw himself at Jarvis with such fury and determination that Rulloff felt compelled to fire a second warning shot into the ceiling, when Merrick still would not desist, continuing his attack on Jarvis with the desperate courage of a man fighting for his life and livelihood. Rolf's patience and self-control finally snapped completely, in a moment that would haunt him for the remaining months of his life. He pointed his weapon directly at the young clerk's head and pulled the trigger without hesitation or remorse. The bullet struck Frederick Merrick instantly, killing him where he stood and spattering his blood across the walls of the room where he had lived and worked. The brilliant scholar who could recite ancient poetry in a dozen languages who had spent years developing theories about human communication and the evolution of language, had just committed the most primal act of violence possible, taking another human life in cold blood. The sound of the fatal gunshot seemed to freeze time for a moment, as if the universe itself was recoiling from the evil that had just been committed. Then Gilbert Burroughs, realizing that his colleague was dead, and that he was now facing three desperate killers who had nothing left to lose, made the wise decision to flee and raise the alarm rather than continue a fight he could not win. Racing through the building and bursting onto the street, Burroughs began screaming for help at the top of his lungs, alerting the entire neighborhood to the tragedy that had just unfolded. His cries shattered the night air and brought people running from nearby buildings, including law enforcement officers, who immediately began organizing a manhunt for the killers. The three criminals fled the scene in panic, racing toward the Chenango River, where they believed they could make good their escape under cover of darkness. But fear and desperation had clouded their judgment, and the confidence that had marked their approach to the crime had evaporated in the face of their transformation from burglars to murderers. Albert Jarvis, perhaps influenced by his scholarly mentor's overconfidence, or simply desperate to escape the scene of their crime, assured his companions that the river was shallow enough to wade across safely. It was a fatal miscalculation that would cost 2 lives and seal Rolf's fate as surely as if he had signed his own death warrant. As the 3 men plunged into the dark waters of the Chenango, the true depth and power of the river became immediately apparent. Jarvis, wounded in the struggle with the Clarks and weakened by blood loss, was quickly overwhelmed by the current and swept away into the darkness. Dexter, who had never learned to swim despite years of criminal activity near various bodies of water, followed his partner into the depths, his cries for help swallowed by the rushing water. Only Edward Rulloff, the mastermind whose brilliant planning had led them to this disaster, managed to struggle to the far shore, gasping and exhausted, but alive. As he dragged himself onto the riverbank, he could hear the sounds of the growing manhunt behind him, dogs barking, men shouting, and the organized chaos of a community mobilizing to capture the killers who had just murdered one of their own. Rolf's attempt to escape Binghamton on foot proved equally disastrous, demonstrating that even his superior intellect could not overcome the consequences of his crimes. At the railroad station, when police officers asked him to identify himself as part of their systematic search for suspects, he made the crucial mistake of running rather than attempting to talk his way out of the situation, behavior that immediately marked him as a fugitive and sealed his capture. His apprehension in a nearby farm's outhouse was almost anticlimactic for a man who had eluded justice. For so many years through wit and charm, the brilliant criminal who had manipulated judges, juries, and law enforcement officials for decades was finally brought down by his own panic and the simple persistence of local police work. Even in custody, Rulloff attempted to maintain his lifelong pattern of deception and manipulation, first claiming to be Charles Augustus, and then George Williams, when pressed for identification. But his past had finally caught up with him in the person of Judge Ransom Balcom, a local official who had followed the notorious case for years and immediately recognized the infamous fugitive, despite his attempts at disguise. The judge's dramatic declaration, "You are Edward H. Rulloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845, rang through the crowded police station like a thunderclap, finally connecting decades of unsolved crimes to the man who stood before them. His additional warning to the authorities: this man understands his rights better than you do, and will defend them to the last," proved prophetic as Rulloff immediately began the legal maneuvering that would mark his final trial. The physical evidence linking Rulloff to the Helbert store murder was overwhelming and undeniable. He had fled the scene without his shoes, and the left shoe found at the crime scene was unmistakably his, stuffed with pieces of cloth to accommodate the missing big toe he had lost to frostbite years earlier. The distinctive modification made The shoe is identifying as a fingerprint, providing proof that even Rudolph's legal skills could not challenge. Documents found on the bodies of Jarvis and Dexter when they were recovered from the Chenango River led investigators to Rolfe's Brooklyn apartment, where they discovered a treasure trove of evidence documenting his double life as scholar and criminal. Maps, stolen goods, false identification papers, and academic manuscripts were found side by side, providing a complete picture of the complex man who had terrorized the Northeast for decades. The trial that began on January 4, 1871, became a sensation that attracted crowds of over 2,000 people daily to a courtroom built for half that number. Newspapers across the nation sent reporters to cover the proceedings, fascinated by the paradox of America's most intellectual killer and the questions his case raised about the nature of genius and evil. Once again, Rulloff conducted his own defense, with the skill and sophistication that had impressed legal observers for decades. But this time, the evidence was too strong and the crimes too clear for even his brilliant advocacy to overcome. The prosecution presented a methodical case linking him to the murder through physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and his long history of criminal behavior. Even as he faced certain execution, Rudolph maintained the grandiose delusions that had driven his entire criminal career. He petitioned Governor John T. Hoffman to delay his execution until he could complete his linguistic theories, claiming that his work method in the formation of language would benefit all humanity and that executing him would deprive the world of invaluable scientific insights. Some prominent figures, including newspaper editor Horace Greeley, actually supported this request, arguing that such a brilliant mind was too valuable to waste, regardless of his crimes. Greeley wrote in the New York Tribune in the prison in Binghamton, "There is a man awaiting death who is too curious an intellectual problem to be wasted on the gallows." Mark Twain, with characteristic wit and insight, satirized these clemency efforts in a letter to the Tribune, offering to provide a substitute criminal to be executed in Rolfe's place if it would preserve such valuable intellectual property for humanity. His mockery highlighted the absurdity of suggesting that intelligence should exempt anyone from the consequences of murder. But all appeals failed, and on March 3, 1871, Edward Howard Rulloff was sentenced to hang for the murder of Frederick Merrick as he awaited execution. He finally confessed to murdering his wife, Harriet, describing in chilling detail how he had struck her with the iron pestle in a fit of jealous rage. However, he never confessed to killing his daughter Priscilla, though he acknowledged giving her a narcotic to stop her crying. On May 18, 1871, before a bloodthirsty crowd of thousands of spectators who had traveled from across the region to witness the execution, Edward Howard Rulloff met his end at the gallows in what would be recorded as New York State's final public hanging. His final words, according to various accounts, were either, "Hurry it up, I want to be in hell in time for dinner," or simply, "I can't stand still," reflecting the complex mixture of bravado and terror that had marked his entire criminal career. Even in death, Rolfe's story continued to fascinate and horrify the public. Dr. Birdwilder of Cornell University removed his brain within hours of the execution for scientific study, declaring it the second largest criminal brain on record at 1,673 centimeters. The brain remains on display at Cornell's Wilder Brain Collection, to this day, a macabre monument to one of America's most complex and dangerous killers. Rolfe's case forced 19th-century America to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of intelligence, morality, and criminal behavior. His story challenged prevailing beliefs that linked criminal behavior to low intelligence and social class, proving that evil could wear the mask of respectability and that intellectual brilliance was no guarantee of moral character. The case contributed significantly to the development of criminal psychology as a field of study, with Rulloff becoming one of the first American criminals to be systematically studied by scientists seeking to understand the relationship between brain structure and criminal behavior. His preserved brain was subjected to every test available to 19th century science, but no physical abnormalities could explain the evil that had resided within it. Today, more than 150 years after his death, Edward Rulloff remains a subject of fascination for criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts who continue to study his case for insights into the criminal mind. Modern psychologists examining his behavior and statements have concluded that he displayed virtually every characteristic of what we now understand as psychopathy, making him a textbook example of this dangerous personality disorder. His story prefigured many of the themes that would define modern understanding of serial killers and psychopaths. The charming facade that concealed murderous intent, the grandiose self-image that justified any action, the complete lack of empathy for victims, and the ability to manipulate others through displays of intelligence and charm. In many ways, he was America's first celebrity serial killer, a man whose crimes were overshadowed only by the terrifying brilliance of the mind that conceived them. The case of the genius killer serves as the eternal reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most civilized, and that the capacity for evil exists independently of intelligence, education, or social standing. Edward Rulloff's legacy is not the linguistic theories he believed would make him immortal, but rather the chilling demonstration that genius without conscience becomes a weapon capable of destroying innocent lives. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that exceptional intelligence should ever be considered as a factor in sparing a killer's life? Or does brilliance make such crimes even more inexcusable? Leave your comment below with your thoughts on the case of the genius killer and whether intellectual gifts should influence how we judge criminal behavior. If you enjoyed this tale of 19th century terror and want more stories like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most civilized, and that true evil can hide behind even the most impressive intellectual achievements.